South Carolina, 1856. There exists a kind of strength that even iron chains cannot erase, and at Harrow Field Plantation that year, that strength had a name, Adeline. They referred to her as the most beautiful woman in the slave quarters, but those who truly knew her understood that her beauty was merely the outermost layer. Behind her steady gaze lay something that deeply troubled Master Jonas Harrow: courage, a quiet, ancestral courage stitched together by generations who had endured everything. To crush that courage, he forced her into the most brutal labors, carrying the weight of 2 men, scrubbing the big house until daybreak, toiling under the cruel watch of Overseer Elias Crow, a man who took pride in shattering any spirit, yet his methods could never shatter hers. What nobody knew, what you're about to witness now, is that Adeline was not merely enduring, she was watching. Every movement, every vulnerability, every aging beam of the plantation, all of it was recorded with the precision of someone biding her time for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment arrived on a night that nobody at Harrow Field would ever forget. Adeline was sent to the upper barn near midnight. The wind battered the old wood, yet something felt different in the air, something that would make anyone hesitate, but she did not hesitate. When Elias entered behind her to supervise, what unfolded next was so unforeseen that even today few dare to speak of it. Only those who were in the quarters that morning truly know what spread through the cabins. A whisper, a secret, an event that rewrote all the rules. They say the sound echoed across the entire plantation. They say the overseer screamed for the master. They say Adeline stood motionless, watching, as if she already knew exactly what would come next. Before we continue with this startling story, please subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Let's grow our community together. Thank you. Now back to the tale. But to grasp what really happened that night, to understand how one enslaved woman reversed the situation and made an entire plantation tremble, we must go back. Back to where it all began. Back to the day Adeline first arrived at Harrow Field and learned that survival demanded more than strength. It demanded strategy. It demanded patience. It demanded knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. And most of all, it demanded never forgetting who you were beneath the chains. Adeline was born in 1832 on a smaller Virginia plantation. Her mother, Grace, was a house servant, beautiful and intelligent, taught to read by a sympathetic mistress who considered education a Christian duty. Grace passed that knowledge to her daughter in secret, late night whispers of letters and words, stolen moments with books hidden under floorboards. Adeline's father was sold away before she could remember his face. Her mother told her his name was Joseph, that he was strong and kind, that he had loved them both. But Adeline had no memories of him, only the absence where a father should have been. Her mother died when Adeline was 8. Fever took her in 4 days. The mistress who had taught Grace to read had passed away years earlier, replaced by a younger woman who viewed enslaved people as mere tools. When Grace died, there was nobody to protect Adeline, nobody to shield her from the harsh realities of her situation. She was sold to a North Carolina tobacco farmer named Silas Pettigrew, who worked his slaves 16 hours a day and fed them barely enough to survive. Adeline spent 3 years there, growing from a child into a young woman, learning that beauty could be a curse when you lack the power to defend yourself. At 11, she was sold again, this time to a cotton plantation in Georgia. The owner was an elderly man, Colonel Thaddeus Reed, who was slowly dying of some wasting disease. His son managed the plantation, and that son was cruel in ways the old man had never been. Adeline worked the fields. Her hands bled from cotton balls, her back ached from constant stooping. She watched people die from exhaustion, from beatings, from despair. She watched children sold away from their mothers, families torn apart, hope draining from people's eyes until they became hollow shells. And she promised herself she would never become that, would never let them take her humanity, would never forget that she was more than property. When she was 16, the colonel's son cornered her in the tobacco barn. He had been watching her for months, making comments, making promises and threats. That night, he decided to act on his desires, but Adeline had learned from observing, from listening to the older women, from understanding that survival sometimes meant fighting even when you knew you couldn't win. She grabbed a tobacco stake and swung it hard, catching him across the temple. He went down bleeding and cursing. Adeline ran. She knew what would happen next, knew she would be beaten or worse, knew her life on that plantation was over, but she didn't care. Some things were worth the consequences. The colonel's son wanted her hanged, wanted her made an example, but the old colonel intervened, not out of mercy, but out of practicality. Adeline was valuable property, young, strong, and intelligent. Killing her would be a waste. Instead, he sold her quickly and quietly to a passing slave trader. And that is how, at 19, Adeline found herself in a coffle of 30 enslaved people, chained together, marching south toward the auction blocks of Charleston. The journey took 2 weeks. They walked 20 miles a day, slept in open fields, ate scraps. Several people died along the way, their bodies left by the roadside, but Adeline survived. She always survived. In Charleston, she stood on the auction block for the first time. Men examined her like livestock, checked her teeth, felt her muscles, made crude comments about her appearance, about what she could be used for. Adeline stood silent and still, eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. The bidding was competitive. She sold for $1,200, a high price purchased by a well-dressed man with cold eyes, Jonas Harrow, owner of Harrow Field Plantation. He looked at her once, nodded to his agent, and walked away. Adeline was loaded into a wagon with 5 other newly purchased slaves and transported inland, away from Charleston, away from the coast, deep into the rural heart of South Carolina. Harrow Field Plantation was massive, 3,000 acres of cotton and rice worked by 87 enslaved people. The big house sat on a hill overlooking the fields, white columns and wraparound porches, beautiful and terrible, a monument to wealth built on suffering. Behind it stood the quarters, 2 rows of small wooden cabins. Beyond that, the work buildings, barns and storage sheds, the cotton gin, smokehouses, and blacksmith forges, everything needed to run a self-sufficient empire. Jonas Harrow was 45, a widower. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, along with their son, leaving him bitter and isolated. He ran Harrow Field with absolute authority, aided by his overseer, Elias Crow. Elias Crow was everything a plantation owner could want in an overseer, and everything an enslaved person feared. He was 38, a poor white man from Georgia who had worked his way up from field hand to overseer through brutality and reliability. He was 6 feet tall, lean and strong, with pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything. He carried a bullwhip coiled at his belt and a pistol tucked in his waistband. He had been overseeing at Harrow Field for 6 years. In that time, he had broken men twice his size, had crushed every hint of resistance, had created an atmosphere of fear so pervasive that people whispered when they spoke his name. The enslaved people at Harrow Field lived under a strict routine. Wake before dawn, work until dark, sleep in cramped cabins with dirt floors and leaking roofs. They were fed cornmeal and salt pork, just enough to keep them working. They were given 1 set of clothes per year, worn until they fell apart. Medical care was non-existent unless you were valuable enough to warrant the expense of a doctor. Families were kept together only as long as it was economically convenient. Children were put to work as soon as they could walk. Old people were worked until they died. It was a system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum humanity. Adeline was initially assigned to field work, cotton picking during harvest season. She joined a gang of 20 women who worked from dawn to dusk with a 30-minute break for a midday meal. The work was back-breaking, the sun was merciless, but Adeline discovered she was strong, stronger than she had realized. She could pick nearly 200 pounds of cotton a day, more than many of the men, and she did it without complaint, without showing weakness, because she understood something fundamental. In this world, strength was currency, and if you wanted to survive, you had to prove your value. But Crow noticed her for different reasons. He watched the way she moved through the fields graceful despite the labor, watched the way other enslaved people gravitated toward her, seeking her calm presence, watched the way she kept her dignity, even when covered in sweat and dirt, and something about that dignity offended him. He had spent years breaking people's spirits, teaching them that they were nothing, that they had no value beyond their labor. And here was this woman who refused to learn that lesson, who carried herself like she was worth something, like she had rights, like she was human. For the first 6 months, Adeline kept her head down and her observations sharp. She learned the plantation's routines, learned which overseers were cruel and which were merely indifferent, learned which enslaved people could be trusted and which were informants desperate to gain favor. She learned that Mama Bess, an elderly woman who had been at Harrow Field for 40 years, was the unofficial leader of the quarters, the one people went to for advice, for healing herbs, for wisdom. Adeline befriended Mama Bess slowly, carefully bringing her water during hot days, helping her with heavy tasks, listening to her stories. Mama Bess had survived by understanding the system, by knowing how to navigate its cruelties, by teaching others to bend but not break. She recognized something in Adeline immediately. This girl was different. This girl wasn't just surviving. She was planning, calculating, waiting for something. Asterisk, what are you waiting for, child? Asterisk, Mama Bess asked her one night, sitting outside the cabin they shared with 4 others. Asterisk, I don't know yet. Asterisk, Adeline admitted. Asterisk, but I'll know it when I see it. Asterisk, Mama Bess nodded. Asterisk, just don't wait too long. Waiting can become a habit, can become a cage all its own. Asterisk, Adeline thought about those words often in the months that followed. The plantation had a blacksmith named Samuel. He was 24, born at Harrow Field. His mother had died in childbirth, and his father had been sold away when Samuel was 10. He had been apprenticed to the previous blacksmith and had learned the trade well. He was valuable to Harrow because he could repair tools and equipment, shoe horses, and do work that would otherwise require paying a white tradesman. This gave Samuel a small amount of autonomy, a tiny space of freedom within the prison of slavery, and he used that space to think, to plan, to imagine possibilities. Samuel noticed Adeline during her 2nd month at Harrow Field, noticed not just her beauty, but her intelligence, the way she observed everything, the way she never wasted motion or words, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. He engineered opportunities to speak with her, offered to repair a broken hoe handle, to fix a bent nail, small excuses to be near her. At first, Adeline was suspicious. She had learned that attention from men usually meant danger, but Samuel was different. He treated her with respect, spoke to her like an equal, listened when she talked. Slowly, carefully, they became friends. They would meet sometimes after dark, sitting outside Samuel's forge, where the dying coals provided light and warmth. They would talk in low voices about everything and nothing about the past and the impossible future. Samuel told her he had tried to run away when he was 16, had made it 40 miles north before dogs tracked him down. Crow had whipped him so badly he nearly died, had spent 2 weeks unable to walk. After that, Samuel had given up on running, had decided that escape required more than just courage. It required planning, resources, timing. It required understanding the world beyond the plantation. And he had spent years gathering that understanding piece by piece. Adeline told Samuel about her life before Harrow Field, about her mother who taught her to read, about the plantation she had been sold through, about the colonel's son and the tobacco stake. Samuel listened intently. Asterisk, your mother gave you a gift, asterisk, he said. Asterisk, literacy is power, it's knowledge. It's the ability to understand the laws they use to chain us. Can you teach me? Asterisk, Adeline asked. Asterisk, I can read a little, but I want to read well. I want to understand everything. Asterisk, Samuel smiled. Asterisk, I can teach you some. I learned from the previous blacksmith. He was an educated man, bought his freedom and taught others before he died. But we'd have to be careful. If Crow finds out we're learning, he'll see it as rebellion. They started meeting 3 times a week late at night when everyone else was asleep. Samuel would bring scraps of newspaper, old almanacs, anything with printed words. They would sit by the forge and Adeline would practice reading by the light of the coals. She progressed quickly. Her mother's early teaching had given her a foundation. Within 3 months, she was reading fluently. Within 6 months, she was reading political speeches and legal documents Samuel had acquired through a network of enslaved people who worked in town. And what she read changed her, because she began to understand that slavery wasn't just local, wasn't just one cruel man on one plantation. It was a system, a legal framework, an economy built on human suffering, and the more she understood it, the more she saw its weaknesses. One night, while reading a newspaper Samuel had obtained, Adeline found an article about a planned slave revolt in Virginia. The revolt had been betrayed before it could happen. The leaders were hanged. But what struck Adeline wasn't the failure. It was the planning, the organization, the fact that enslaved people across multiple plantations had coordinated, had communicated, had worked together toward a common goal. We could do that. She said quietly. Samuel looked at her. Do what? Organize. Adeline said. Not a revolt. We don't have the numbers or weapons, but something else. Something that undermines the plantation from within, makes it less profitable, creates chaos, and in that chaos creates opportunities. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you're talking about sabotage, small acts that can't be traced back to any one person. Yes, Adeline said. A tool that breaks at the wrong moment, a gate left unlatched, information shared at the right time. Individually, these things mean nothing, but together, over time, they add up. They make the plantation less efficient, less stable. And if we do it right, if we're careful, they'll never know it's deliberate. Samuel nodded slowly. It's dangerous if we're caught. But living is dangerous. Adeline interrupted. Existing here is dangerous. At least this way we're fighting back. At least this way we're doing something. They brought Mama Bess into their confidence. She was old, but she was wise. She had survived longer than anyone at Harrow Field by understanding how to navigate the system. When they told her their plan, she listened without interruption. Then she said, you're both playing with fire. If Crow suspects anything, he'll torture people until someone talks, and someone always talks under torture. I know, Adeline said. That's why we keep the circle small. Just the 3 of us initially. And we're patient, we don't rush. We wait for the right opportunities. Mommy Bess studied her for a long moment. You remind me of someone I knew long ago. A woman who refused to accept her chains. She organized a workload and got people to resist without seeming to resist. It worked for 2 years before she was caught. What happened to her? Adeline asked. They sold her down the river. Mama Bess said. Louisiana, never heard from her again. But for those 2 years, she made them pay for every ounce of labor they extracted. She made them know we weren't animals. We were human beings who could think and plan and fight back. The sabotage started small. A plow blade that developed a crack and snapped during critical planting season. A barrel of seed corn that got wet and moldy through a mysteriously leaking roof. A gate to the pigpen that came unlatched, allowing the animals to escape and root through the vegetable garden. Individually, these incidents meant nothing. Accidents happened on plantations all the time, but over the course of 6 months, the incidents accumulated. Productivity dropped, costs increased. Jonas Harrow became frustrated. Elias Crow became suspicious. He started watching people more closely, started questioning workers, started using his whip more liberally, trying to intimidate people into confession. But there was nothing to confess, or rather, no one person knew enough to confess. Adeline also began gathering information about the plantation's operations. She learned that Harrow kept detailed ledgers in his study, documenting every expense, every purchase, every sale. She learned that he was deeply in debt, had borrowed heavily to expand his operations, was dependent on high cotton yields to make his loan payments. She learned that he had political connections, was friends with the local sheriff and several state legislators. But she also learned that those connections were transactional, based on money and influence. If Harrow lost his wealth, he would lose his protection. This knowledge became a weapon, something she could use, something she filed away for the right moment. Then Jonas Harrow made a decision that changed everything. He decided that Adeline was wasted in the fields. Her beauty and intelligence made her suitable for housework, where she could serve guests and reflect well on his estate. He ordered her moved to the big house, assigned her to cleaning and serving duties. Crow objected, said Adeline was a troublemaker, said she needed to be broken, not promoted. But Harrow overruled him. I know what I'm doing, Harrow said. Besides, I want her where I can watch her, where she can be properly trained. Crow accepted the decision, but his resentment deepened. He saw it as Harrow going soft, saw it as a sign of weakness, and he began to plot how he could regain control, how he could put Adeline back in her place. Working in the big house gave Adeline access she had never had before. She saw the inner workings of the plantation's management, saw the ledgers and correspondence, heard conversations between Harrow and his business associates. She learned that the plantation was in worse financial shape than she had thought. Harrow had made bad investments. The cotton market was unstable. He was one bad season away from bankruptcy. She also learned something else, something that would prove crucial. Harrow was lonely, isolated by his position and his grief. His wife's death had left him without companionship, without anyone to talk to. And in Adeline, he began to see not just a servant, but someone intelligent enough to converse with, someone who could fill the silence of his empty house. He started calling her to his study in the evenings, ostensibly to serve him drinks, but really just to have someone present, someone to talk at. He would drink whiskey and ramble about his problems, his debts, his frustrations with Crow, his memories of his wife. Adeline would stand silently, expressionless, but inside she was cataloging everything, every complaint, every vulnerability, every piece of information that might someday be useful. And slowly, carefully, she began to respond, not with opinions that would be too bold, but with careful questions, innocent, seeming inquiries that encouraged him to reveal more. One night after several drinks, Harrow looked at her and said, "You're not like the others. You understand things. Someone taught you well." My mother, Adeline said quietly. She believed education was important even for people like us, people like us. Harrow repeated. You mean slaves? He seemed to be testing her, seeing how she would respond. I mean people whom others think are less than human, Adeline said, meeting his eyes, but who know better. Harrow stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, not a cruel laugh, but a surprise one. You're dangerous, he said. You're the most dangerous kind of slave. The kind who thinks, who questions, who refuses to accept their station. But I admire that. I find it stimulating. From that night forward, their relationship changed subtly. Harrow began to treat Adeline differently, not as an equal, he would never go that far, but as something more than property. He gave her better clothes, better food, moved her into a small room in the big house instead of making her walk back to the quarters each night. Other enslaved people noticed the preferential treatment. Some were jealous, some were worried. Everyone knew that the master's attention could be dangerous. But Adeline assured them she was using the situation, gathering information, building trust that could someday be exploited. And mostly, they believed her because Adeline had never steered them wrong. But Elias Crow saw only what looked like a slave being rewarded for nothing, given privileges she hadn't earned through subservience and fear. It offended his sense of how the world should work, offended his belief that enslaved people should be kept broken and afraid. He began to watch Adeline obsessively, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for an opportunity to expose her, to prove to Harrow that she was manipulating him, to restore the proper order where overseers like Crow held the real power and masters like Harrow simply provided the authority. Months passed. Adeline's position in the household became more secure. She had access to almost every room, was trusted to handle correspondence, to manage household accounts, to interact with visitors. She used this access carefully, copying documents when possible, memorizing conversations, building a detailed understanding of Harrow's business dealings and personal connections. She also maintained her connection with Samuel and Mommy Bess, meeting them when she could, sharing information, continuing the small acts of sabotage that slowly undermined the plantation's efficiency. Then Samuel received news through the underground network of enslaved people who communicated between plantations that there were white people in the North, abolitionists who were actively working to end slavery, who provided money and resources to help enslaved people escape, who would hide runaways and help them reach free states. This network existed, it was real, it was dangerous, but it was possible. We could make contact with them. Samuel told Adeline and Mommy Bess one night. We could plan an escape, not running blindly, but with help, with a destination, with people waiting to receive us. The three of them discussed the possibility for hours. The risks were enormous. If they were caught, they would be tortured and killed. If they ran and failed, they would be hunted down by dogs. But if they stayed, they would die here anyway, slowly, worn down by labor and despair. At least running offered hope, offered the possibility of freedom. They decided to make contact with the underground network, to send word north that people at Harrow Field needed help. Samuel knew a man who worked on a neighboring plantation, a man who had connections, who could carry messages. They would start there and see what came back. 2 months later, word returned. There was a Quaker family in North Carolina, 3 days' travel north, who helped runaways. If people from Harrow Field could make it that far, they would be hidden, fed, and passed along to the next station, eventually reaching Pennsylvania and freedom. But the escape would need to be carefully planned. Multiple people traveling together would be noticed. It would need to be small groups spaced out over time, and someone would need to go first to prove the route was viable, to establish contact. Adeline volunteered immediately. I'll go, she said. I have the most freedom of movement. I can probably get a day's head start before anyone realizes I'm missing. And once I'm north, I can send back information, help others follow. Samuel objected. It's too dangerous. If you're caught, Crow will kill you. He's been waiting for an excuse. I know, Adeline said. But someone has to go first. Someone has to prove it's possible. And I have something none of you have. She pulled out a small bundle of papers she had been hiding in her room. These are copies of Harrow's correspondence, his ledgers, proof of illegal activities. Even though slavery is legal, there are laws about how enslaved people can be treated, laws about record keeping, laws Harrow has violated. If I make it north, these documents can be used to build a case, to bring authorities down on Harrow Field, to free everyone. Mama Bess looked at the papers in awe. Child, if Harrow finds out you took these he won't find out. Adeline said firmly. Because I'm not going to fail. They set a date 3 weeks away during the Harvest Festival, when attention would be focused on celebrations and most of the overseers would be drunk. Adeline would slip away in the evening, head north, traveling at night and hiding during the day. She would have no food, no supplies, nothing that would indicate she was running. She would rely on the network, on the kindness of strangers, on her own intelligence and determination. Samuel made her a small knife from scrap metal in his forge. It wasn't much, but it was something. Mama Bess gave her a small pouch of herbs for healing and for protection, both medicinal and spiritual. And they prayed together, asking for strength, for courage, for the ancestors to guide her path. But 3 days before the planned escape, Jonah's harrow hosted a dinner party. Wealthy plantation owners from across the region, men who controlled thousands of enslaved people, who shaped the politics and economy of the state, gathered. Adeline served them, invisible as always, listening to their conversations, and what she heard made her blood run cold. They were discussing secession, discussing the possibility of war with the North, discussing what would happen to their human property if abolition was forced upon them. And Jonah's harrow said something Adeline would never forget. Asterisk, if it comes to war, if they try to take our property, I'll burn this entire plantation to the ground with every slave locked inside before I let them steal what's mine. Asterisk, the other men murmured agreement, nodded their heads, raised their glasses in a toast to Southern pride and property rights. Adeline stood against the wall, her face perfectly neutral, but inside she was screaming with rage. These men, these wealthy, powerful men, would rather commit mass murder than acknowledge the humanity of the people they claimed to own, would rather destroy everything than admit they were wrong. And in that moment, Adeline's plan changed. She would still run, would still try to reach the North, but if she failed, if she was caught, she would make sure Jonah's harrow paid. Would make sure this plantation burned not with enslaved people locked inside, but with only its guilty owners to suffer the flames. The night of the harvest festival arrived. Enslaved people from across the plantation gathered in the largest barn. There was food, more than usual, and music, fiddles and drums, people dancing and singing, trying to find joy in the brief respite from labor. Jonah's harrow and his overseers watched from the barn entrance, enjoying the spectacle, congratulating themselves on being benevolent masters who allowed their property such privileges. Adeline moved through the crowd, saying quiet goodbyes to people who didn't know they were goodbyes, hugging Mama Bess a little longer than usual, clasping Samuel's hand and holding his eyes, telling him without words that she would make it, that she would send for him, that this wasn't the end, but the beginning. As the evening wore on, as the overseers grew drunk and distracted, Adeline slipped out of the barn, walked calmly toward the big house as if going to fetch something. But once out of sight, she kept walking past the big house, past the quarters, toward the tree line at the edge of the property. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady. She had been preparing for this moment for months, had memorized her route, had hidden a few supplies at strategic points along the way. She reached the trees and disappeared into the darkness. Behind her, the sounds of the festival continued. No one noticed she was gone. No one would notice for hours. By the time they did, she would have a significant head start. Adeline walked through the night, following creek beds and game trails, avoiding roads, heading north by the stars. She had studied the night sky from Samuel, who had learned it from the previous blacksmith, knew how to navigate by the North Star, how to find direction even when clouds covered the sky. She walked for 6 hours without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Harrow Field. By dawn, she was 10 miles away, exhausted but exhilarated. She found a thick grove of pine trees, crawled into the center where she couldn't be seen from outside, and slept for 4 hours. She woke to the sound of dogs, distant but distinct, bloodhounds baying on a trail. Her trail. They had discovered her absence probably when the festival ended, and she didn't return to her room. Crow would have organized a search party, immediately would have sent the dogs out with something that carried her scent. And now they were coming faster than she had expected. She abandoned her hiding place and ran, heading deeper north, trying to reach the river Samuel had told her about. Water would hide her scent, water would give her a chance, but the dogs were getting closer. She could hear them clearly now, could hear men's voices shouting. She ran harder, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, branches tearing at her clothes and face. She broke through the tree line and saw it, the river, wide and fast, moving. She didn't hesitate, plunged in. The current was stronger than she expected. It pulled her downstream. She fought to keep her head above water, to swim toward the opposite bank, but the current was relentless. She went under, surfaced gasping, went under again. Her dress was heavy, dragging her down. She tore at the buttons, managed to shrug it off, wearing only her shift now. She swam with everything she had, reached the far bank, and pulled herself out, collapsed on the muddy shore. The dogs reached the near bank moments later. They ran back and forth, confused, whining. They had lost the scent. Crow and 3 other men arrived on horseback. Crow stared across the river at the empty far bank. She's over there somewhere, he said. Spread out, find where she came out. But the river was a quarter-mile wide at this point. There were dozens of places she could have emerged, and tracking through water was nearly impossible. The search party split up, began searching both banks, but they were moving slowly, unsure, and Adeline used that uncertainty to gain more distance. She ran parallel to the river for several miles, then cut east into the hills. The terrain was rougher here, rocky and steep, harder to track. She climbed until her legs gave out, found a cave, really just an overhang of rock, and hid there. From her vantage point, she could see back the way she had come, could see the distant figures of men on horseback, could see the dogs running in confused circles, could see Crow's frustration even. From this distance, she watched until evening, until the search party gave up and headed back toward Harrow Field. Only then did she allow herself to believe she might actually make it. That night, Adeline continued north, walking through darkness, falling and getting back up, cutting her feet on rocks, tearing her hands on thorns, but moving, always moving. By dawn of the second day, she was nearly 30 miles from Harrow Field, far beyond where any previous runaway had made it. She was in territory she didn't know, following instinct and the stars and desperate hope. She found wild berries and ate them, drank from streams, tried not to think about how hungry she was, how tired, how much her body hurt. She just focused on the next mile, the next hour, the next step. On the third day, she saw a farm in the distance, a small homestead, and something about it looked different. The barn was painted, the fences were well maintained, there was a windmill turning slowly. It looked prosperous, but not in the way plantation big houses did. It looked like working prosperity, earned, not extracted. She watched the farm for an hour, saw a white woman hanging laundry, saw children playing, saw a black man working in the garden, not enslaved. She could tell by the way he moved, by the fact that he stopped to drink water when he wanted, that he spoke casually to the white woman. This was a free black man, or at least a man not currently under the lash. Adeline made a decision. She was starving, exhausted. She needed help. She couldn't make it much farther without food and rest. She walked toward the farm, openly, hands visible, trying not to look threatening. The woman noticed her first, called out to the man. He straightened up, watched Adeline approach. When she was close enough to speak, she said, "Please, I need help. I'm running from a plantation in South Carolina. I'm trying to reach the north." The woman and man exchanged glances. Then the man said, "You're 3 days from the Quaker family. You've come far farther than most." The woman added, "You look half dead, child. Come inside, we'll feed you, let you rest." They brought her into their small house. The woman, whose name was Margaret, gave her bread and milk. The man, whose name was Josiah, stood watch at the window. "We can't let you stay long," he said. "People around here know we're abolitionists. They watch us. If they see a runaway here, they'll burn us out." "I understand," Adeline said. "I just need a few hours, just enough to rest and eat." "You'll need more than that," Margaret said. "You'll need a guide. The route north is complicated, easy to get lost, and there are slave catchers between here and safety." Josiah nodded. "I'll take you as far as the Quaker family. It's too dangerous for Margaret and the children, but I know the way. We'll leave tonight." Adeline slept for 6 hours, the deepest sleep she had had in years. When she woke, it was dark outside. Josiah had a horse saddled and ready. He had packed food and water, had a rifle across his saddle. Margaret gave Adeline a dress that fit properly, shoes that weren't worn through, a coat for the cold nights ahead. "You're very brave," Margaret said. Asterisk what you're doing running alone. Takes courage most people don't have. Asterisk asterisk I'm not brave, asterisk Adeline said. Asterisk I'm just tired of being owned, that's all. Asterisk asterisk that's what brave is. Asterisk Josiah said asterisk being tired of injustice and doing something about it. Asterisk they rode through the night. Josiah knew paths that avoided main roads, knew which farms were safe and which would turn them in. They stopped twice to rest the horse, to eat, to drink. Josiah told Adeline about his life. He had been born free in Maryland. His parents had purchased their freedom before he was born. He had moved south to help with the underground network, to guide people north. It was dangerous work, but it was necessary work. Asterisk someone has to do it, asterisk he said. Asterisk someone has to be willing to risk everything to help others. That's how we win, not through violence, but through small acts of courage repeated over and over until the system can't sustain itself. Asterisk by dawn they were in North Carolina, still another day's ride from the Quaker family. They stopped at a small church Baptist. The preacher was a colored man who welcomed them inside, gave them food, let them rest in the church basement. He told them news. There had been increased patrols. Slave catchers were being more aggressive. Several people had been caught trying to escape north. Harrow from South Carolina was offering a $500 reward for a woman matching Adeline's description. Josiah looked at her. Asterisk you must have made quite an impression. $500 is a lot of money. Asterisk asterisk I took something from him, asterisk Adeline said. Asterisk something more valuable than money. I took his pride. I showed him that his power was an illusion. That's what he can't forgive. Asterisk they left the church in the afternoon, rode until evening, and finally reached a modest farm with a simple wooden sign. Asterisk Johnson family, the Quakers. Asterisk Josiah knocked on the door. An older white man answered, gray beard, plain clothes. He looked at Adeline and nodded. Asterisk thee is welcome here. Asterisk he said in the formal Quaker manner. Asterisk come inside, rest. Thee is safe now. Asterisk Josiah clasped Adeline's hand. Asterisk this is where I leave you. Asterisk he said. Asterisk the Johnsons will take care of you. Get you to the next station, eventually to Pennsylvania. Good luck. Asterisk asterisk thank you. Asterisk Adeline said. Asterisk thank you for everything. For risking your life for someone you don't even know. Asterisk asterisk we're all connected. Asterisk Josiah said. Asterisk your freedom is my freedom. Your bondage is my bondage. That's what they don't understand. That's why they'll lose in the end. Asterisk the Johnson family hid Adeline for a week. During that time they heard news that shocked everyone. A massive fire had broken out at Harrow Field Plantation. It started in the big house in the middle of the night, spread to the barns and outbuildings, destroyed nearly half the plantation's infrastructure. Jonas Harrow barely escaped with his life. Several overseers were killed, including a man named Elias Crow, who had been sleeping in one of the barns. The fire was being investigated as suspicious, possibly arson, but with no clear suspects. Everyone knew Harrow had many enemies, both enslaved and free. Adeline listened to this news with mixed emotions. She hadn't set the fire had been miles away when it happened, but she knew who probably had. Samuel, following through on their original plan, using her escape as cover to burn Harrow Field to the ground. She hoped he had made it out, hoped he had found a way to escape in the chaos, but she had no way to know. All she could do was continue north, continue toward freedom, and hope that someday she would get word that her friends had made it out alive. The Johnsons passed her to another Quaker family farther north, who passed her to a Methodist preacher, who passed her to a free black community in Virginia. Each stop was a few days. Each guide took her farther from South Carolina, farther from slavery, closer to freedom. And with each mile, the weight on her chest grew lighter. The fear began to recede, replaced by something she barely recognized. Hope, real, genuine hope that she might actually make it, that she might actually taste freedom. 6 weeks after leaving Harrow Field, Adeline crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state. She was brought to Philadelphia, to a boarding house run by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. They gave her a room, food, clothes, safety, and for the first time in her life, Adeline was freed, truly free. She stood in her small room, looked in the mirror, saw a woman she barely recognized, thinner, harder, scarred but unbroken. And she allowed herself to cry, to release years of rage and pain and grief, to mourn everything she had lost and everyone she had left behind, to grieve for her mother, for her father she had never known, for every enslaved person still suffering in chains. But she didn't cry for long, because freedom brought responsibility, brought opportunity, brought the chance to fight back in ways she had never been able to before. She still had the documents she had stolen from Harrow, the evidence of his crimes. She gave them to the Abolition Society. They used them to build a case, to publish exposés, to name Harrow Field Plantation as an example of ongoing atrocities, to put political pressure on local authorities. It wouldn't free anyone immediately. The system was too corrupt for that, but it planted seeds, created cracks in the foundation, contributed to the mounting tension that would eventually explode into war. Adeline also began working with the Underground Railroad from the other end, helping new arrivals, teaching them to read, helping them find work, giving them the tools to build new lives. 3 months after she arrived in Philadelphia, Samuel appeared. He had escaped during the fire, had been passed north through the same network. When they reunited, it was like finding family, like discovering that not everything had been lost. They told each other their stories, filled in the gaps. Samuel confirmed that he had set the fire, that he had waited until Crow was alone in the barn, until the other overseers were drunk and distracted, then he had struck. I burned it down, he said. The big house, the barns, everything. I made sure people got out first, warned everyone in the quarters, but the overseers, Crow and his men, them I locked in. Let them burn. I'm not sorry. I'd do it again. Adeline took his hand. I'm not sorry either. She said. They deserved worse. Samuel nodded. Mama Bess made it out too. She's at the next station, should be here in a few weeks. There are about 15 of us total who escaped. The rest scattered or went to other plantations. Harrow's ruined, though. His plantation is destroyed, his reputation is destroyed. Even his political friends have abandoned him. We won, Adeline said quietly. Not completely. Not yet, but we struck a blow. We showed them that enslaved people aren't powerless, that we can fight back. That we will fight back. 5 years later, Adeline and Samuel were married. They had 2 children, they had bought a small house. Adeline had become a teacher at a colored school. Samuel worked as a blacksmith. They were building the life that had been stolen from them, living the freedom they had fought for. But they never forgot where they came from, never forgot the people still suffering in bondage. They continued working with the abolition movement, with the Underground Railroad, helping others escape, telling their stories, bearing witness to the truth of slavery's cruelty. When the Civil War began in 1861, Adeline was 29. She volunteered with the Contraband Relief Association, helping formerly enslaved people who fled to Union lines, providing food, clothing, education, support. She also served as a scout and spy for Union forces, using her knowledge of Southern plantations, her ability to pass in certain spaces, her intelligence and courage to gather information that helped win battles, helped free communities, helped end the war faster. Samuel joined the United States Colored Troops, fought in several major battles, survived the war, and returned home with honor. After the war ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, Adeline did something she had been planning for years. She returned to South Carolina. Not to Harrow Field, that plantation had been destroyed during the war, but to the county, to the region. She came with federal authorities, with documentation, with witness testimony. She came to ensure that Jonas Harrow faced justice for his crimes. But when she arrived, she learned that Harrow had died 2 years earlier, broken and impoverished, living in a small house in town. All his wealth and power gone, destroyed by the fire Samuel set, by the war, by the collapse of the system he had built his life upon. Some people told Adeline she should feel cheated, that Harrow had escaped earthly justice, but she didn't feel cheated. She felt victorious because Harrow had lived long enough to see everything he valued destroyed, had lived long enough to experience powerlessness, to understand what it felt like to have your world taken away. That was justice enough. What mattered more was helping the people who had survived, the formerly enslaved people who now faced an uncertain freedom, who needed education, land, opportunity, tools to build new lives. Adeline spent the next 30 years doing that work, building schools, organizing communities, fighting for civil rights and equal treatment under the law. She lived to be 71, died in 1903 in Philadelphia, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them free, all of them educated, all of them carrying forward the legacy of resistance and resilience she had embodied. In her final days, she told them stories, made sure they understood where they came from, made sure they knew the price that had been paid for their freedom, made sure they understood that freedom isn't a gift, it's something you fight for, something you protect, something you pass on to the next generation. The night before she died, Adeline's oldest granddaughter asked her, grandmother, "Were you scared that night you ran away? Were you terrified?" Adeline thought for a long moment, then said, "I was terrified every day of my life until I ran. Scared of being beaten, scared of being sold, scared of what men like Crow would do to me, scared that I would die without ever knowing freedom. But the night I ran, the moment I stepped into those trees and chose to risk everything, that was the first time I wasn't scared because I had finally taken control. I had finally made a choice that was mine. And once you make that choice, once you decide that freedom is worth dying for, fear loses its power over you." She closed her eyes, smiled, and said, "They called me the most beautiful woman in slave quarters, but beauty had nothing to do with it. What made me dangerous, what made me powerful, was that I refused to believe their lies. I refused to accept that chains defined me. I refused to let them steal my humanity, and that refusal, that simple, stubborn refusal to accept bondage, that's what gave me strength. That's what let me turn the tables. That's what let me burn down the world they built and walk away free." Adeline died peacefully that night. Her last words were, "Tell them, tell everyone, tell them that no chain is unbreakable, no system is permanent, no oppressor is invincible. Tell them that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. Tell them that one person armed with truth and determination and the refusal to accept injustice can change everything. Tell them my story, tell them I was here, tell them I fought back, tell them I won." And her family did tell. They told her story for generations, passing it down, keeping it alive, making sure Adeline's courage and sacrifice and victory were never forgotten, making sure that everyone who heard it understood that resistance is always possible, that freedom is always worth fighting for, that the human spirit cannot be chained no matter how heavy the iron. And that is the true power of Adeline's story. Not just that she escaped, not just that she survived, but that she proved something fundamental about human dignity, about the unstoppable force of people who refused to be broken, about the inevitable triumph of those who fight for justice, no matter the cost. They called her the most beautiful woman in the slave quarters, but history remembers her as something far more important: a warrior, a survivor, a woman who looked at an impossible situation and found a way to turn the tables, who burned down the plantation that tried to own her, who walked away free and spent the rest of her life making sure others could do the same. That is the legacy of Adeline, not beauty, not submission,